I'm Paul Hoskins. I'm the chairman and founder of Precedent. We have been in the education or delivering to the education sector for 30 years. Over that 30 years, we've seen a lot of common issues arise, and I think it's quite interesting to see how they're culminating in the whole digital transformation space. Michael Frantzis, our principal education consultant, is going to give you a presentation now. He's going to talk about some observations and some recommendations. Some answers, possibly, but not all of them. So I hope you enjoy it, and yes, I'll hand you over to Michael.
It's great to see so many of you here. So I'm hoping this means that we've somehow, what we're saying will resonate with something that you're already experiencing. I know that on the program it said, I think, why transformation fails, and we will definitely tell you about that. But we also want to try and recast your minds a bit. I can think of nothing within a university space. I had a career within a university before joining Precedent as well, that creates so much excitement, and at the same time, so much fear, loathing, and resentment. There's something like transformation, or digital transformation specifically, because it just seems so difficult to do. And there's common problems that we experience all the time. It takes ages to get anything done, so many silos, this kind of stuff. It's all very common stuff that we understand, but ultimately we all know that kind of something's got to happen. And how do we recast our minds a bit? And what I want to do is almost like dial back the emotion level. I was thinking about this before today and offer a bit of what I would call transformation mindfulness, and a little bit of self-reflection about what universities do and why that creates particular issues when it comes to digital transformation within those kind of environments that are actually very specific, but you just need to grasp them, think about them, articulate them, and they are relevant right from the top all the way down to the bottom, because you can't achieve anything unless the entire institution somehow knows how to do it. You'll see what I mean, hopefully, as we go through the presentation. Now, Paul's already mentioned who we are. I mean, we call ourselves full service. We came out of a design and build environment driven by strategy. We've done very many websites, very many strategy pieces, very many thought pieces for the education sector. But I'd like you to begin to reimagine towards the end of it the kind of relationship you would have with a partner like us in the context of what I'm going to talk to you about, and we'll talk to you a little bit about how agencies like ourselves are evolving to meet the real kind of challenges I'll be talking about. So, it's obvious, right? It's changing. So we have, for example, on one side, the government introducing regulatory changes around a competitive marketplace for education. We have, FE making inroads into really sort of taking over the space around apprenticeships, careers. We have a difficult press landscape around tuition fees. I was at an interesting talk yesterday with VCs discovering what kind of narrative are relevant to students now in this kind of environment. There's pressures on VC pay. And we also know that digitization is as much part of that picture. But there's method in my metaphor, so to speak, in that I'm not sure it's entirely tangible. We see very, very, very many articles talking about this, and then we struggle to articulate responses in the university sector. Obviously, brand's part of it, but how does the delivery of what we do as a student experience connect with that brand? What is it that's actually we need to do? How do we react to something that actually is probably quite powerful in the environment? We read LinkedIn articles all the time. How do we really relate it to us? And everyone's under pressure, because we might be talking about the number of people applying, the number of people going through clearing this year, but that whole sense of change plus the political landscape really makes us wondering kind of what a university is about and how can we react. And it's not just, I've talked about stuff that's specific to the sector, almost inward-looking, and I was interested by seeing this talk with the Vice-Chancellors yesterday. A lot of the answers seem quite inward-looking in terms of the narratives we're telling. For example, universities are great centres of research, and without them, society wouldn't be able to progress, and students need to become part of that. But I'm wondering, actually, I use this image deliberately. We all know, as VR comes along, all this sort of stuff, that technological change is somehow around the corner. And I refer to Bill Gates, who often talks about technology. We overestimate what's going to happen in 2 years' time, and we underestimate what's going to happen in 5 years' time. And so we have a feeling, seeing, let's say, the young lady using her VR goggles, that this is somehow relevant to us. We know it's coming, but we overestimate the impact of that, and it also allows us to kind of rest on our laurels for a while, but don't really understand long-term where it's going. So this is a picture that's very, very hard for, especially at legacy institutions like universities. The elite ones have a prestigious past to rely on and easy recruitment chains, say the post-92s in a different environment thinking, how do we react to this? We are also older institutions now. I mean, let's face it, 25 years ago, post-92s, probably not relevant anymore to students. How do we react to this? Is this something that we leverage to make our product better? Or is it something we need to fear? Or is it something we need to really embrace? And how do we do that in the kind of environments that we have? Academics, that kind of thing. And in the face of that pressure, what generally happens? Because of the ways universities are structured, not very much. You'll often get, probably you're all familiar here with, we're going to do another 5-year vision piece, and we'll work out where the university needs to be in 5 to 10 years. And then you become struggling, I guess, in terms of marketing and comms people out here. You find yourself looking at your own agendas, thinking, what do I do with it? And it's fine in terms of messaging, but in terms of what the university does in the face of that pressure, I'm not sure it necessarily gets you that far. And often it will be small spends, something like 30K, 5K, or whatever. Or you get the opposite. In other words, everyone gets a very big idea and applies a very big capital expenditure budget to it, passes it through procurement, and tries to find a way to radically transform the organization that way. And there are many apocryphal stories going around about multi-million-pound budgets that have got nowhere. And certainly in our experience at Precedent, we've often seen tenders come to us, and we look at them and we think, we're not sure this is entirely manageable. We spend a lot of time writing them, going back to them, and 6 months down the line, that particular project is now cancelled or never got off the ground because it was trying to do too much. So that's it. You either get paralysis, which I think probably is a real reflection about what a lot of people feel about this space, or you get this massive overreach and frankly overspend of student and public money. So I'd like to go a little bit into more of the specifics about why this happens, because actually we at Precedent talk a lot about the human side of technology. It's not just systems. There's got to be some sort of thinking, some sort of empathetic thinking about what's going on, why you're doing it, and that's the starting point. And that takes an understanding of the environment. It takes an understanding of your own environment and the kind of relationship to technology and the relationships you have between each other to actually somehow find your way, articulate your way to a solution. So I'm going to take a slight pause because we're also very much interested in what you think. So up there, it's a very, very, very short one-answer survey. So I don't know if you mind putting that link into your mobiles, smartphones, etc. And there's an option to enter a prize draw where you get a couple of days of our consultancy from Precedent to help you build an internal business case or something similar. So I'm going to get it in a minute. You can obviously do it as I keep talking, but if you don't mind. That's assuming you like me. Go back a slide. Oh, sorry, that was silly, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. Everyone good? Everyone got the URL? Okay. So, chapter 1, treating it as a digital problem. Tangentially, we all know what these are. These are silos, and I can't imagine probably the number of articles I've read about the problem of people working in silos. And that has an obvious impact on the way that processes happen, on the way that money is spent. And it's obstreperous, but it's also obstreperous for anything, even if it's not digital. There's nothing particularly connected to transformation about the problem of working in silos. The problem of working in silos applies to anything in terms of business processes, in terms of efficiencies, that sort of stuff. And so often you go through the literature and you say, why does transformation fail? Silos. And it kind of makes sense, but I'm not sure that's actually really the truth of it. It's not the fact that we have silos at all. In some ways, particularly within universities, is that the real problem is that the head of digital is in his own silo. Now, this particular silo might be marketing, this particular silo might be IT, or even communications. It's really fascinating to us often where projects emerge from within universities. And there is someone who is, I find, often ironically called, nothing personal about them, the head of digital. Because I'm not sure we entirely know what that means, because ultimately, digital kind of underpins anything. And the difference between thinking about it as silos is the problem, is that digital isn't a thing that's kept separate within its own silo. Ultimately, digital, like anything, is underpinning ideas around what people think, relating to people, and it's thinking about product. And what does that mean? It means that digital is actually bringing about, let's say, a reshaping of what I refer to here as the product landscape. Because we go back to that sea churning away in the background, that context we're all operating in. We know that, like in so many other industries, digital is bringing about something that means probably the education product isn't going to look the same as it did 10 years ago in 10 years' time. I refer back to Bill Gates' phrase again. And the fundamental realization about that is that we now live in a society, the girl with the goggles, that actually digital underpins everything we do. The idea of having a head of digital as a silo in itself doesn't make any sense for the reality. If you went into a large corporate or something like that, you'd see very much digital underpinning everything, because it's fundamental now. You can't design a product, especially like learning, which is under so much pressure from the likes of LinkedIn and other providers trying to get into, let's say, the CPD space, the apprenticeship pace. You can't see it as a separate thing that needs to be stuck onto a university. But what that actually means is, in order to make transformation succeed, you have to realize that it's all at stake, the entire thing, the price of the product, what the product does, how you relate to students. And failure to grasp that and to relegate digital to something that's a separate department that has a head off means ultimately you can't really achieve very much in real terms that will react to the pressures both in terms of keeping students on side as well as how society is evolving around us, let's say the digitization of it. It's about people and product. It's not about digital. That's what transformation is. Chapter 2. Multiple philosophies. Again, I was intrigued to go to the very, very relevant, very interesting talk yesterday about what stories really matter to students and what universities should get behind, values, transformational learning experience, etc. But that's at a high level, because actually what really happens is that universities are actually many, many, many things. I had a career as a researcher before I went into, let's say, the delivery side of academia and then coming into Precedent. And I saw that the very, very many identities that universities have, starting here with places of cutting-edge research. I'll come back to what that means a little bit later. But that's one thing. It's an environment that prides itself somehow on changing the world, be it in science, be it in humanities, that kind of thing. It's also a place where star academics live. And I don't know about your experience, but often I would say those academics who wield influence in terms of research funding, in terms of the reputation of a university, wield a particular influence on the university as a whole. In contrast to, often, committed teachers. And I avoid the word lecturers deliberately because within universities I think there are loads of people who are actually very committed to pedagogy and the idea of teaching and how to do it, who are very much in contrast between, let's say, the academics I refer to who secure £10 million from the EU every year, and that's what they for. All of whom have very specific ideas, and then you actually have students, right? So within that, you see there are a whole number of different ways of thinking about what a university is for, because students probably ultimately just want to get things done and have a job, the majority of them. Some of them might be ambitious, they might want to be Johnny Ive. And you can see that. It's fine having a narrative about let's say, university as a hallowed place of learning and transformational experiences, but in reality, it's all these things competing with each other. We talked about silos. I imagine many of you have come up against this idea of how do I get through the governance procedures of where I am. And again, it's not the governance that's the problem. It's the reason the governance is there in the first place, and it is those competing ideas of what the universities is for. So what they actually do is they actually keep the status quo, and that's entirely their point, because you need somehow to have academic regulations feeling that they're important enough. You need somehow administrative teams feeling they're important enough, senior leadership feeling important enough, and you tend to get these quite complex, in some ways quite flat structures that prevent collaboration because they are about keeping those philosophies in check. And what that means is that the boundaries are just too high to achieve something organizational that can really react to the fact that digital has changed the game, has changed everything in terms of the product, the price, and all of that, because the governance structures of the university support those competing philosophies. And within that, it becomes extremely difficult to articulate what the transformation is for and why you're doing it. So it's not so much blaming the governments, it's like I said before, it's failure to address the question that there are philosophies that are very different with the university and treat it as the multi-headed machine that it is. Because often those big spends, what are they doing? They're trying to mandate from the centre with a lot of money, which inevitably will come up against resistance because those structures don't support spending £15 million on a transformational product because they are ultimately serving correctly the agendas of all those different philosophies about what a university is for. Chapter 3. Temptations of technological thinking. I put a smiling Mark Zuckerberg on there because I think he probably personifies this best. I could have put Google, I could have put Apple, I could have put Johnny Ive, any of them. But it's seductive. Now it feels a little bit dark. But it's something we're all thinking about, that societal pressure, right? As in, they've sort of set the agenda for how the world communicates, how it should be, how it could aspire to be, always connected, these kinds of ideas. But I think there's something going on in terms of people who have to think about technology, see how it works in their industries. That's pervasive, that particular universities being susceptible to kind of this image. And I'll go into a bit more detail. When we hear about tech, when we hear about digital, there's not 2 seconds before you'll hear the word disruption. It was a Silicon Valley idea. Technology has to disrupt. Otherwise, what's the point? Because you won't end up like Mark Zuckerberg. And like you can see just a number of businesses that support that. But also, those kind of businesses are trying to get their way into the education industry because they're feeling they have to disrupt it. Because that's what digital does, right? And even worse than that, it's got to be revolutionary, right? It's got to change the world. If you deploy some technology, it's got to change the world. And I think that universities are particularly susceptible to believing that applies to them as well. And it's partly out of pride, it's partly out of those philosophies I spoke to you about. I don't know if you know this chap called Mr. Klein. Does anyone know the story of Low? You may not know this, but Low was the first ever message that was sent across a TCP/IP connection, and that's the protocol that uses that the internet is based on now. And this researcher here was the man who did it. He was a Lodi researcher, and what he was supposed to have sent was login, and that he ended up sending low. But the point is, he sent low from UCLA to Stanford. And that's because universities effectively were there at the birth of the internet, right? They were there at the birth of TCP/IP. And that's because the internet grew out of computer science. And I referred back before to that idea of universities being proud of being a place of cutting-edge research. Yesterday we heard a talk talking about how we wouldn't have our iPhones without universities because Johnny Ive went there, that sort of stuff. And actually, I think deep down, most universities think that they should be revolutionary and disruptive in this space because, let's face it, they invented the internet, really, with the help of the American Department of Defense. They are capable of cutting-edge research. They are capable of changing the world, which is definitely true. But the problem is, they're much more adept at transforming other people's sectors than their own, and that's because that's how the funding works. It's very easy for someone to get 15 million quid from Technology Strategy Board, focus very tightly on a piece of technology that will change the world, and just develop it. And that's within the context of a rigorous, well-known process of publication of knowledge. That does not apply to itself. And this legacy comes through, for example, your IT department's wondering, why can't we just build stuff ourselves? Why don't we know? And I know it feels subtle, but I feel it's quite important about how we think about technology within universities. And this has an impact both at that IT level and much higher up the chain, because you end up thinking, we can do this, we were there at the beginning, we have the Janet backbone of the internet, we can do it, and we end up with overreach, £15 million projects to go nowhere, because actually you're not very adept at doing it. Or that feeling that if we don't achieve something that's revolutionary, if we don't achieve something that disrupts the marketplace, then what's the point in doing it? Because that's the benchmark that's been set by society around us. And it traps people, leaders, people down the chain in a mindset that unless I can change the world, it's just not worth doing. And what that means is there's actually not enough of a focus on just simple things that can make a difference to the student experience, which should be leading this kind of transformation. Chapter 4, the wrong agenda. I don't know if you've seen the film, Glengarry Glen Ross, but that phrase, always be closing, resonate. I'm talking about salespeople, of course. And suppliers are an important part of the picture, obviously. You couldn't do it without them. But obviously, they're all trying to sell to you, and they're all trying to sell to you on a given agenda. So when you come up with your small or large budget, you're going to end up probably coming up against one of these. In the flavour of what I was talking about with we've got to be revolutionary, there are many, many educational, ed tech for short, startups, telling you, crikey, it is going to be revolutionised, it's all going to be different in 5 years' time, you've got to adopt this technology right now, otherwise it'll all be over. And kind of, but that's not respecting the fact that universities have been around for hundreds of years. Teaching isn't just about technology, it's about human experiences, etc. And they don't know. Nobody really knows. Or the software vendors out there, I don't know if you know what this is. This is a screenshot of SITS, much loved and maligned around the university sector. And they would suggest that buying a solution will solve the problem somehow. And that would be driven, say, by procurement processes. I've got a problem. I can't register my students quickly enough, or I'm going to save you 500 grand by streamlining your exams publications. All of which is relevant, but driven by an agenda of what the vendor thinks should be happening, and isn't necessarily something that would impact the experience for students as much as you might think. It's a very much inward-looking thing. So you've got these two competing agendas of it's going to change the world, you've got to buy it now, which is almost too difficult to swallow, and for good reason, because you've got to respect the legacy you have, or established vendors trying to tell you that they can solve the problem as well, and for a lot of money. But at the end of the day, we really need to ask ourselves, what do they need? And it's the failure to do that, and it's these agendas from the salespeople, not so much the salespeople, the agenda of different strains of thinking about education that are dominating the discussion with procurement and senior leadership, rather than a fundamental rethink in the context of that, in this context of digital changing everything, that is kind of the problem. It's not pursuing the only agenda which matters. That's it. Digital thinking reduced to some sort of choice between a number of ways of thinking about education through the use of technology on its own. Probably not enough of the right kind of information to understand what the student need is to really deliver on transformation, those sort of key objectives. And actually, thinking in this way is the only way you're going to begin to tackle this problem of internationalization. What do students in China want, all this kind of stuff? You need to have a focus on the student side of transformation. And inevitably, if you don't meet these things, and you take a vendor-driven approach, spend big, fail big. Chapter 5, the wrong skills. Yes, again, you go to LinkedIn, you'll say, lack of right skills means often transformation fails in an organization. We've all read the articles. But again, it's not necessarily just about coding. And we always have this assumption that The skills in digital are about the ability to write C, front-end code, design a CMS, design a database, all this sort of stuff. But it's not. Those are, I guess, what we would call the tools with which you deliver stuff. But we often see also in these articles lack of leadership as being a problem. But what is not really well elucidated is that the reason there is a lack of leadership is because there's not enough digital literacy. In a sense that when you make these decisions, you've got to be thinking, well, the delivery of this component, is it possible? What are the constraints that it provides upon my organization? How does it connect to the vision? Those people who are in a position to make the decisions need to understand how digital society is evolving, need to understand how students think about digital, need to understand the realities of, for example, it's fine if a vendor tells me that their new solution will solve my problem. But there might be an alternative way of looking at it within your organization that says, this man in MI who has access to this bit of data, if he just connected that database to that database over there for the cost of roughly £1,000, might achieve a similar result. But to begin thinking about these things, you need to have some kind of understanding of systems, data, and not just beyond that, content, user experience, all these sorts of things, because that is the human side of what digital is for. And digital literacy is not technical skills, it's the ability to connect technical skills to the human side of things. And we won't see leadership in this sector until we have people in place who can do that. Not saying that there aren't any, but it's often, again, we're looking at the reasons why it fails, is that we don't. And this kind of thinking gets delegated down the chain, back to the head of digital who really doesn't have the power to change anything, and doing so fundamentally undervalues digital, and then you get nowhere. So you can see how it's all kind of interrelated. And actually, procurement is really seen as being part of this picture, because what procurement does, it supports, I guess, a government regulatory way of buying stuff. So in other words, it sees a problem, it articulates a solution, comes up with questions to score it, and that's the end of it, and then you score against it, job done. And that supports the way vendors think, it supports the way other companies think, and we all react to try and fit in with the way procurement thinks about stuff. But actually, there's a particular skill set around procurement that actually needs to change. They need to be digitally literate too, because they are going to be the ones that are going to be buying the stuff. They almost need to become part of an extension of the senior leadership team. So as they need to be helping with those discussions with the suppliers. So to reiterate, digital skills aren't just computing skills. You know, your systems are useless without the right content within them. You could have the best CMS in the world, but if your content isn't up to it, what's the point? So content generation is as much a digital skill as anything else. Understanding it is as important as using it, and actually, we need a realization that digital is as part of everyone is effectively involved in a product that's changing, and that goes all the way up and down the chain, and everybody needs to understand that, have the skills to understand it. And finally, this is connected, working with the wrong partners. I hope you've got to the point where you see what I'm thinking there. It's not necessarily technology solutions that give you what you want. So choosing things just from the perspective of technologists isn't necessarily going to get you very far. But also, it's not necessarily just a question of management. Because what happens? We see a problem. The spending big means we take probably a very large consultancy, one of the established ones, and say, change my model. Or we think small, and we think, oh, if I just change my CMS, often we'll see a project that says, change my CMS. How does that connect to the student experience, apart from just change the delivery model? And you don't have relationships with partners who are about managing this relationship between product, people, and technology. You have partners who sell you management, you have partners who sell you tech, or in some cases, design. And there's a fundamental lack of realization that actually you need partners who can think in this space, but also there isn't actually partners who can do all of it, because it's becoming so ubiquitous in society. Like I say, you can't necessarily be brilliant at content, be brilliant at advertising, be brilliant at data, and all these kind of things. It's actually impossible. And the unicorn supplier out there doesn't exist, and procurement is trying to find it. And we almost need to break down this idea that a system will save it, and it needs to be about the relationships with partners long term, because it's not going to be fixed in a year, it's not going to be fixed in 2, it's about a culture. And I'm going to go on to that culture next. Way forward. I've told you some problems, and they probably feel very different from the kind of problems you've thought about with transformation up to this point. And I hope you see one thing, is that there were 6 different things, but they're all fundamentally interrelated. Skills, how you think about digital, philosophy, vision, partnership, and the lack of these things, which is causing the problem. But it's easy to say, in this kind of abstract kind of way, those are the problems, and I hope you feel they are specific to HE. The real thing is, okay, how do I articulate some kind of way forward within this space? Because I hope you agree with me, maybe you don't. Most of the way things are done now means it's very difficult to make progress. And I would say the solution is interrelated as well. I called it the wheel of change. So the segments in the middle are things that you need to get right. And the reason it's almost a wheel is that they're all interrelated, but it's also these are things that have to cut across all the departments. And you'll see that they offer you a way to cut across those departments to allow digital to kind of foster itself. The first one is the audiences, and then the outer spoke is the things that you can do, or the things that you can input to make a difference to these things. So audiences is basically you need to understand who you're dealing with. Now, we're all familiar with the idea of getting segmentations of students, but I mean a commitment to a knowledge base about what your student body needs, wants, and your researchers, and this can be qualitative, it can be data-driven, etc. On the outside, data is the thing that can help you with that, a shared repository of data. I hesitated a little bit about calling it information, because I think we think about data in a very particular geeky way these days, but we'll talk about that later. You need a vision. How do you get a vision? You need some kind of leadership to input it. We'll talk a little bit about what that leadership will look like. You need the right skills. Obviously, training gives that. You need something called a digital backlog. I'll explain that again a bit later. And these, I've called them technology and UX audits, will tell you, and that's the state of play of your product. You need the right kind of procurement, driven by objectives, not by problems. And you need the right kind of partnerships. And what do you need for those? You need relationships. You don't need solutions provided, you need relationships. But I'll go into these one by one, and you'll see hopefully how they connect to you. Audiences, data. Again, I thought about information because it's not just about geeky data, it's about qualitative understanding. You know, actually, it could be within your organization, people know what they want, depending on their own experiences. But I'm talking about this idea that we continually measure, analyze, and innovate based on this information set that you all commit to as a university. One example I looked around was Leeds City Council. And what they did actually is they don't have the money to start spending a whole load of data scientists exploring stuff. But what they did is they created an open data model that they then published to the world and said, go ahead, use it, obviously anonymized in the right way. And what did this do? The organization just became an enabler to allow people to do their thing with that data. So it's like publishing, using this idea that information is relevant to anyone. And this is the kind of thing they had. They had actually people in the environment coming up with their own solutions. Like this is a map that someone did. You could check, for example, where there were greatest effects of heart attacks, for example. And that was done by someone who's not within Leeds Council, but just by taking this new approach to thinking about how they use their data, they were beginning to create new services and extract new insight just based on the fact that they released it and treated it as part of the common good. And this is something that can help them guide how they target their own interventions when it comes to general health within the organization. Just done by treating data as a common model. And you think about the same thing within your own context. If you're all proficient in and have an understanding of that data that exists within the university, you can begin to really rethink about what your segments look like and how you measure them. Digital backlog. What are these? So it's true that actually we talk a lot about 5-year visions, but nobody really understands the state of play. So we have those silos create solutions that are bought, for example, SITs. We have student records thinking about one thing. But as an organization, it's very difficult to get an understanding of actually what your state of play is. And this is as much about the technologies that you have and the user experiences that you have, and they're not necessarily the same thing within a university, but they are connected. And the input for those are the kind of audits that I could talk about. But what you need is a backlog that everyone agrees with, that's a reference point to where your organization is. Example, UCL came to us once. UCL Connect was a commitment to them to really understand how they could unify their student experience across, 25 systems and I think 900,000 web pages. And from the point of view of a set of agreed user journeys through the entire UCL lifecycle, we've begun to understand a user connects with this system at this point in their cycle, they connect with this system in their cycle, and we begin to identify the problems. And as you look at it, you begin to realize that actually the problem might be just that the design of the interface on mobile doesn't work. And it could be something as simple as that. So UCL Connect could have gone one way, let's spend £10 million rebuilding everything, or it could have looked at its snapshot and gone, you know what, I'm going to spend £10,000, fix that on mobile, and I have made a significant leap forward into how students think my IT services are run, just for so much less money. But to do that, you need that kind of audit. It looks a bit like this. That probably looks very geeky, but down there I can begin to, I have different pain points, different systems that they communicate with, and I filter and I think I want to tackle the student journey for undergraduates in science, or I want to tackle the problems with this system. And you think, right, if you want to tackle the problems with the system, then maybe you might need a big project like a new data model, but maybe you won't. And then the one on the right was, we mapped a little bit how they were thinking, and actually we realized that within the organization, there were already initiatives going on that were completely disconnected, but actually entirely connected when you bothered doing this exercise. So for example, they already had a common data model they didn't know about that was going on within the IT department. They already had a review of how university courses are approved, and that, in a sense, would be an opportunity to find a way making that information digital first. And they already had a web content research group trying to work out the content strategy. And they didn't know this until they'd done this exercise. Again, money saved because they bothered, because transformation really actually involves making sure those are talking to each other. That's all it is. It's not expensive. And then they realized, well, we've got 900,000 sites. One option might be I'm going to spend £1 million trying to rebuild all my content. Another one was, well, redesign search so it's personalized. So you see, the solution might be solve the navigation. Don't try and spend a huge amount of money. Again, £20,000, £30,000 and you've done it. You need a vision, and to create that you have leadership. But the really important point about this is not about seniority. This vision doesn't come from the top necessarily. And it's actually something that everybody needs to do, empowered by the right skills. It needs to be achievable, and it needs to be pragmatic, and it really isn't the domain of the senior leadership team. Everyone can do it. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. University of Oklahoma. They had a program, it's almost occurred spontaneously, where a bunch of managers got together. They weren't SMT, they were a little bit down. And they thought, actually, how are we going to react to this? And they came together and sat down in a room over a period of time. They came up with this idea of the transformative learning principle. And it kind of began to think about what are the things that really have an impact in terms of retention, in terms of what makes a difference to our students, and this is what they came up with. Discipline, knowledge, leadership, service learning, civic engagement, global cultural competencies, health and wellness, research, creative and scholarly activities. But something like the service learning, civic engagement, they realized that people who are involved in research, actually, if they went out into the field, that had a significant impact on their retention and happiness as students. And you can begin to see how this kind of vocabulary, this kind of thinking about the student experience can be quite powerful as you begin to imagine how digital is deployed. And this had nothing to do with the SMT. This had the idea of people within the university feeling empowered to come and talk to each other and setting a vision, providing leadership, and not necessarily relying on the SMTs to do it. And that, you can see, can have quite sort of transformative effects in its own. And finally, oh no, there's one more. Skills and training. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to whip. This is about demystifying the web. It's not about going straight into one particular part of the department and making sure that your developers really understand the latest cycle. It's taking a broad view, like I talked about earlier, about what constitutes digital and what's it for and how can you best deploy it. What is the human side of it? My example, the Met Office. Now, the Met Office actually is a commercial organization that the government expects it to earn revenue. And it did some research thinking, what are we going to do? How do we create something that's digital? What's what we do with our data? And they had this. They came up with this idea that people aren't interested per se in weather data, but they are interested in the what, the why, and the when. But to use that, they had to get the people who are the geeky scientists working with the marketeers to see how those two could actually work together. And so they started doing things like this. So they realized that satellite imagery was actually the thing that lots of people liked, so generating little videos about satellite imagery. Also, something like a pollen calendar, you can see how that would be interesting to people who have hay fever. How did they do it? They had training that made sure that the geeks, effectively, understood what the digital marketeers wanted and had the necessary skills to generate this kind of material on the fly. So again, it's not about making sure that people could code. It was about making sure the organization was digitally literate and digitally savvy, and they transformed how the meta-office could be perceived in the outside environment just by doing that. And again, it's simple stuff. It's not cutting-edge research. And finally, procurement. I will do relations. I talked about procurement. The difference with procurement, actually, we need to start deploying, we need to start thinking about stuff based on objectives, because currently procurement is about buying solutions to problems, buying updates to systems, and it's not really focused on objectives. For example, it might be increased student retention, but it might be increased brand presence within the marketplace. How is that measured? How do we do it? All this sort of stuff. Procurement needs to be at the forefront of deploying spend in that way, and almost it needs to be accountable, a bit like a product owner, because that really is what's lacking with universities at the moment, is a product owner. My example here, a university in America called St. Thomas, and I just wanted to get across this idea of how they started thinking about themselves in this way. So they started splitting up their thinking about digital in terms of customer experience, engage, partnerships, connect. You can see the core IT, which is the stuff that runs, and smart technologies. And I'll just leave a quote of how they think about it. So this is the student engagement section. We provide best-in-class digital and online experiences for our community. We gather and analyze metrics, as well as evaluate use of St. Thomas's systems, applications, and screens to improve processes and usability. We create a culture of empathy focused on earning loyalty through positive moments of service interaction. And that's the thing that is driving what they're trying to do. That's the thing that's driving their procurement. And you can begin to think to yourself, well, actually, if we all adopted that kind of philosophy, how much difference that would make across the organization. And finally, partners. You can't do it in an explosive way. Obviously, you've got to have the training. You've seen how it's all connected together, the skills, the right leadership, the right culture, the right procurement. But you can't do it on your own. It's impossible for a university to be able to do all of this. And it's about longer-term conversations with partners, and it's not about buying them with projects, we think. And it needs to be the partners who are proficient across all these domains that I've talked about: build, design, data, university processes, that kind of thing. And those relationships matter internally between yourselves as much as it does with people like us. I go back to St. Thomas's, and that's how they said themselves. We foster sustainable partnerships and digital ecosystems that give St. Thomas new strategic capabilities. And that's what people like ourselves and your partners should be about to help you on this particular journey. So I'm going to summarize. Digital transformation isn't ultimately about digital. We talked about this. It's about people and it's about products. And that's what's taking it first. And you need to start from that standpoint. Digitization of society demands ever greater expertise to realize these products. And I hope I've taken you through some of those things. And to get anywhere, you do need some kind of alliance with the best in breed across all of these domains. And we feel that actually if you start from a perspective of what's actually been out there for a while, strategy, design, and build, it gives you an interesting perspective, because what design and build, certainly the website, et cetera, have been doing for a while is they've been making things that are real, making things that are tangible based on a given evidence base. And you've got to make some progress now. I've given you some ideas about the institute, how the institution needs to modify and how you can go about it, but using the techniques of design and build at the lowest level, at the highest level, gives you a perspective on doing it that will allow you to build products that work now in an iterative way. That means you don't have to spend 15 million quid. But it does need to be connected to the right set of domain experts across training, across content, across data, across all those kind of things. You need to be able to connect that kind of thinking about building real products with the right kind of expertise across the whole domain. And that's kind of where we come in, and that was where we see sort of the industry around digital going. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to explain a little bit about how Precedent is evolving into something we're calling the Alliance to sort of respond to this problem.
Well, I'm actually not going to, we've run out of time, so I'm not going to talk about us, I'm going to talk about you. What I'd say is that we've examined ourselves and found ourselves wanting in some of the areas that need to be fulfilled to deliver to you as a client. And I think so. We've got specialist design and build people, business process re-engineering, data scientists, and everything. And that takes an inward look at ourselves to say, where are we failing? The one thing I would say to you is examine yourselves, examine what you don't know, and actually then adjust how you approach projects in the future. I think that very much from your senior management, I don't think there's enough understanding about what digital might enable. So you don't get enough direction from above. Procurement at the other end isn't delivering to objectives because it doesn't have any. And you've got these really bright people in the middle that have got their own tasks and they're pulling in slightly different directions. Start to get that right, and then work with a supplier that doesn't say we can do everything. Then you will have less failures. And don't buy systems. Systems don't solve problems. They create them. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed it.